The medieval ages were a fascinating time of major events, startling prophecies, and important written works by wise sages. Knowledge was truly power, and closely guarded by those in authority. Today, we live in a world where it seems we are given a constant stream of information, though we often wonder if it contains the value that knowledge held centuries before. Hello everyone, my name is Craig, host of this channel. Here we will present often overlooked information from civilization's medieval ages in an interesting yet compact manner. For this series, the medieval period will be defined as that fascinating time between 500 AD to 1500 AD. After presenting the important information behind each medieval topic, I will offer my opinions on how they influence modern society. Thank you for joining us at Medieval to Modern, and please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss another informative episode. Today, we will travel back to the Peasants Revolt of 1381 in England. In a 1984 article from the Bulletin of the Institute of Historical Research, Frederick Peterson translated a very important letter which dated from June 17th of 1381. It was written by the aldermen and other merchants of the Hanseatic League in London, who were part of a group of commercial interests from Northern and Central Europe. Thanks to his efforts, we have a first-hand account of what was happening during the dangerous days of the Peasants' Revolt in that city. A portion of that letter reads as follows. Start a quote. First of all, friendly greetings. We would like your wisdom to know that on the day of Corpus Christi, two counties near London called Kent and Essex came with all of their might to the city of London to speak with the king. When they entered, they were joined by a great number of inhabitants of the city of London, so that they carried out great misdeeds, as they cut off the heads of the king's chancellor and his treasurer, and many others. They also slayed many foreign people, namely any Flemings they could find. Therefore, all foreign people had to be vigilant and guard themselves as best as they could. Hence, the good people of London were prevented from protecting the foreign people, despite it being proclaimed that foreigners should not be harmed. That is why we all stayed secretly with our London friends, because we reckoned we would be protected there so long as the bad people were in the city. This happened on the third day, and God and his beloved mother be praised that none of us has suffered a penny worth of damage by the date of this letter. End quote. That letter described the height of the Peasants' Revolt as it ravaged various streets of London. During the year 1381, there were numerous peasant revolts which occurred in England, making it appear the country itself was nearing a major change in power. Though in terms of ferocity and danger, the revolt in London held no equal at that time. When we speak about the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, people should realize it did not happen as a random act of sudden rage. These actions occurred because of festering frustrations the peasant class endured for many years. These grievances included how England was being governed and an oppressive social structure which left them at the bottom of the feudal system. Peasant grievances began to increase in those years after the Black Death, which arrived in England during 1348. By this time, this horrible period ended. Labor was made scarce, as up to half of England's population perished during the tragic pandemic. However, for fortunate survivors, they assumed this lack of labor would surely increase the value of their work. Even though thoughts of better wages and working conditions entered the minds of many peasants, it was not meant to be. Unfortunately, in the medieval ages, fair outcomes for peasants were not a common or even occasional occurrence. Therefore, under King Edward III's reign in 1351, the Statute of Laborers became law. Wealthy landowners of the aristocracy used their immense influence to have a law created which kept the wages of common people artificially low. Additionally, restrictions stated that wages could not be requested that were higher than before the plague. Physical movement was limited so that peasants could not seek out better working terms or conditions. This unfair law was yet another major grievance of the peasant class against the oppressive feudal system. When combined with the knowledge that peasants had to work up to twice a week at times on church lands for free, a peasant's family means of sustenance became increasingly less. Enter the radical preacher and reformer John Ball, assumed by some to have been born in Colchester, England. His fiery words brought him into conflict at various times with Simon of Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, leading him to be jailed more than once. Ultimately, John Ball, who was bitterly opposed to the feudal system's class system, was excommunicated by the church in 1366. Nevertheless, he would appear again years later for an important appearance at the Peasants' Revolt in London. As years moved forward, England's involvement in the 100 Years' War left the country's treasury empty. At the same time, having paid most of this war's costs for years, aristocratic barons did not want to finance these conflicts on their own any longer. So in 1377, John of Gaunt introduced a new levy called the poll tax as a solution for funding the war effort. Alas, there was a nasty twist with the implementation of this levy. Under the poll tax, peasants would be made to foot the bill alongside landowners and aristocracy. Furthermore, peasants would pay the same rate as these wealthy higher classes. This raised even more anger towards the advisors of young King Richard II, since peasants believed they provided unjust ideas like this poll tax to him. As we know today, taxes do not usually make a one-time appearance, especially when they bring in decent revenue. Thus, 3 times the poll tax was introduced, raising the amounts payable each time. However, in response to these increases, more and more people began refusing to pay it. It was when the nobleman John of Gaunt calculated the poll tax revenue for the year 1380 that he too became angered, for that year produced the least revenue yet from the poll tax. With money desperately required by England, he was not about to let non-payment go without consequences. The despised John of Gaunt sent out collectors to obtain payment in full for this unpaid levy. Unknown to these collectors, they would be facing hostile peasants that viewed this onerous poll tax as the ultimate disregard for their livelihoods. Added to festering discontent was deep anger concerning misconduct committed by various poll tax collectors in the past. This poll tax had pushed the peasants' outrage to the maximum. On the 30th of May 1381, John Bampton was in the town of Brentwood, county of Essex, to collect these unpaid taxes. The one man elected to speak for the villagers in Fobbing and Brentwood stated their refusal to pay. This man, Thomas Baker from Fobbing, told the tax commissioner these people had already paid their taxes. John Bampton did not take kindly to these words from Thomas Baker, though as the commissioner ordered the arrest of 100 townspeople in response, they rioted. Commissioner Bampton and his men were attacked, enduring bodily harm as they fled for safety. This incident began the Peasants Revolt of 1381. The authorities knew this action could not be tolerated. Therefore, on the 31st of May, another tax collector arrived to the same place with soldiers for payment. Though once again the townspeople, organized and laying in wait for retaliation, were not having it. During the peasants' violent response, 6 soldiers were beheaded and the remainder fled for their lives. With this treasonous bloodshed, the townspeople knew they had entered a grave situation from which they could not extract themselves. Soon, word spread quickly as opposition mounted against the poll tax collectors. At last, a large force of peasants gathered together for a march on London to present their demands in the presence of King Richard II. These included a lowering of the poll tax, the end of serfdom under the oppressive feudal system, a change in the law courts, and the dismissal of the young king's seemingly corrupted advisors. On the 2nd of June, townspeople organized from all over the southeast of England for a march to London. Their main goal was to plead their grievances directly with King Richard II without his advisors' influences. Nevertheless, their rage against those they felt kept them beneath dignity continued. As they made their way to the capital, these marchers destroyed tax registers and the buildings in which they were held. In addition, tax officials who resisted the marchers' actions were beheaded. From north of the River Thames, the Essex, Norfolk, and Suffolk peasants also began their march. They too engaged in similar destructive actions as the south of Thames rebels on their way to London. This appeared to be a coordinated military-style pincer movement on the capital, not the random movements of disorganized peasants. As the mainly Kentish rebels carried forth, they elected a highly regarded Kent man named Wat Tyler as their leader. His followers, who came from all sorts, included farmers and tradespeople, and increased in number as their march continued onwards. Along the way, they laid waste to cities such as Canterbury, performing various bloody executions. Then, on June the 11th, they continued their march from Canterbury to London. At the same time, a movement of targeted destruction occurred as the rebels from Essex, Suffolk, and Norfolk counties marched on London from north of the River Thames. On June the 12th, at Blackheath, southeast of London, the previously mentioned radical preacher John Ball made a key appearance. He urged to stand up for better terms and rights. John Ball's fiery sermon roused the rebels to new heights of action. On June the 13th, they entered London after gaining access to cross London Bridge. At the same time, the Essex, Suffolk, and Norfolk rebels that approached from north of London come into the capital through Aldgate. With anger rising in the throng, and encouraged by their convictions, these protesters were now joined by rebels from within the city. They began burning and ravaging targeted buildings such as the Savoy Palace, owned by the despised royal advisor John of Gaunt. In addition, the rebels began attacking prisons, releasing those in custody. Homes of Flemish immigrants were also destroyed. Then, revolting peasants sought out to execute various people named on a list of their suspected enemies, which included members of the legal courts. They ran apace amongst the streets, while making frightening wails, searching relentlessly to capture their targets. When successful, the rebels left bloody bodies littered on the streets of London. King Richard himself had to seek safety from this ruthless violence in the Tower of London, along with his government officials. On June the 14th, with options few as much of his army was fighting campaigns in France, the 14-year-old king agreed to meet the protesters in East London at Mile End. The peasants' desires included the end of bonded labor, the elimination of serfdom, and general amnesty for the rebels. So, to these demands, the king appeared to concede, though when asked to hand over the traitors on their enemies' list, King Richard II declined. Instead, the king implied he would perform any justice required. A separate force of rebel peasants gained access to the Tower of London through open gates that awaited the king's return. These rebels quickly entered to search for more targets on their enemies' list. Prime foes they soon found and murdered included the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Treasurer Robert Hales, among other officials. Though after the Mile End meeting, and satisfied with the words of King Richard II, many Essex rebels left the city. Now, Wat Tyler and the mainly Kentish rebels continued to roam the streets on their intended mission. With these remaining rebels still in the city, because all of their demands were not met in full, a desperate king had only one tactic to rely on. It was his fervent hope that the rebels still relied upon him to keep his word to them. So, on the 15th of June at Smithfield, just outside London, he met again with the rebels. Accompanying him were over 200 men to meet hundreds of rebels. On arrival, the king called out for Wat Tyler to meet him. When the king asked why Wat Tyler and his rebels did not leave the previous day with the others, Tyler became angered and requested further demands. These requests included abolition of the aristocracy except for the king, and disbursements of all of the bishops' and lords' money to the common people. After requesting water and beer, Tyler received a verbal assault from a royal squire. When Tyler challenged the squire to come forward, the mayor of London stepped forth to intervene. Then Tyler struck out at the mayor. In response, the mayor, who was clad in armor, stabbed Tyler. When a wounded Wat Tyler tried to retreat into the company of the rebels, he fell from his horse. With chaos a breath away, the well-armed rebels stood ready to fire. King Richard II at that critical moment rode forth. Mounted on horseback, King Richard II told the rebels he was their king and to follow him onwards to Clerkenwell Fields. As he had hoped earlier in the day, the king was successful in having these peasants hold off from their assault. Soon after, they followed him to Clerkenwell Fields. Now, as he slowly bled to death, Wat Tyler looked out for refuge in a nearby abbey. Alas, the king's men searched for and found Tyler, bringing him outside the abbey before severing his head. It was put on a pole for display as these soldiers rode off with it to Clerkenwell Fields. At the same time, William Walworth, Mayor of London, had brought in reinforcements to maintain control at Clerkenwell Fields. When the royal forces showed these peasants that their leader was dead, the rebels conceded their fight and asked for mercy. Soon they dispersed, traveling back to their villages and towns, save the rebellion's main supporters. For obvious reasons, they wished to remain away from detection as outlaws, though King Richard II would not let the revolt go unpunished, needing to deter further uprisings. Later, many of these outlaws were found and massacred before an official purge began. Soon after Smithfield, the king raised an army of thousands of soldiers in London to suppress remaining revolts across the country. King Richard II made extensive efforts to seek out the Peasants Revolt's key leaders to have them executed. John Ball was hung, drawn, and quartered during his execution on July the 15th. The man who was credited by many to have started it all, Thomas Baker, was captured before being hung, drawn, and quartered on July the 4th. Which brings us to the time at which Medieval to Modern will give its opinions on how the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 influenced modern society. We believe lessons are ageless, as well as knowledge, and this event is no exception to that view. Now, let us move forward from medieval times to modern perspectives. In my view, this is an event from the medieval period which resonates today due to four vital reasons. First of all, it has been noted the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 served as a template for organizing revolts by the common people even centuries later in history. This revolt showed that suppressed classes in oppressive systems, like the peasants under a feudal structure, could organize effectively in mass numbers. Ruling classes in England at the time witnessed that common people were not rabble of little intellect. As time moved forward, a modernizing world could see that common people's wishes and approval needed greater consideration in making government more accountable for all its citizens. Secondly, the seeds for modern concepts of freedom in England were sown by the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Under serfdom, families were bound to the same landowners for generations, their lives controlled by the whims of an indifferent ruling elite. In the decades which followed this revolt, a major change developed in this relationship between landowners and serf. Gradually, the records of landowners were less focused on the obligations of labor and more to prove laborers earned their freedom in addition to land, free and clear. With this ability to own land that could be passed down through generations, former serfs had increasing control of their destiny and economy. In modern times, we take for granted these hard-won ideals of self-determination. However, we must recognize being a participant in modern society still involves engagement, effort, and awareness. Otherwise, those that seek to disguise and impose newer versions of feudal systems in modern times will once again exercise unjust power over the common people. The third important reason we should remember this peasants' revolt today is because of economic inequalities. From poll taxes to artificial restrictions on labor for the peasant classes, this revolt was very much about unfair economic practices. When the rebels demanded disbursements of all the bishops' and lords' money for the common people, they were seeking an equitable means of providing for the less fortunate in their society. Once again, seeds for growing a society in England which looked after the economic security of all citizenry were sown in this revolt. It would take centuries before modern societies would seriously heed these messages from the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Nevertheless, English governments using punitive economic laws to control and oppress their citizenry became less of an option in the centuries after the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The issue of economic inequality faces our world with the same urgency it did in 1381. Similar to those times, our planet faces a severe concentration of wealth which creates hard socioeconomic consequences. Today, according to some estimates, the richest 1% of this planet control over half the world's wealth. One could wonder if this indicates a stealth transfer of wealth from the lower classes to the top through unjust economic policies, especially when financial rules and regulations are created and benefiting those well placed in the ruling classes, just as in 1381. The fourth way we feel the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 influencing modern society is in regards to the mobility of labor. Today, the middle and lower income classes may not be tied to a feudal system, though in order to survive, many of these people must stay in their current employment to provide basic shelter and food. There is no opportunity or time to seek additional skills or education to increase their employable resources. The increasingly growing gig-based economy employs workers that ply their trade for many companies that do not offer basic benefits. This creates circumstances that undercut the basic financial security of employees living in our modern society. Comparing today's economic mobility between classes to serfdom during the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 shows a number of surprising similarities still exist. In 2019, a Sutton Trust and Social Mobility Commission's report found that rigid class structures still dominate British society. The combined 7% of the population that attended private schools and 5% that attended grammar schools comprised 46% of the members of Parliament, 49% of British Broadcasting Corporation executives, 68% of newspaper columnists, 79% of the House of Lords, 73% of public body chairs, and 85% of senior judges. After noting these facts, one realizes such disparities in British society have not been adequately addressed over 600 years after the Peasants' Revolt. Thank you for supporting us at Medieval to Modern. Please be sure to watch our next episode. Also, be sure to like, subscribe, and spread the word about this channel so we can create more exciting content. I wish you good tidings, as we remember that sharing knowledge has been a noble deed throughout the ages.